June 5, 1942. The Crimean sun rises over the limestone ridges of the Bakhchisarai district, but the dawn brings no warmth, only a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrates through the soles of a soldier's boots. In a massive hand-cut chalk trench, nearly 4,000 German engineers and anti-aircraft crews stand in silent, practiced synchronization. They are the attendants to a god of iron. Slowly, the world's largest railway gun, the Schwere Gustav, begins to elevate its 80-foot barrel toward the southern horizon. It is a machine of impossible proportions. 1,300 tons of steel, supported by a dual-track railway system that stretches into the distance like a permanent scar on the earth. The air smells of thick lubricant and ozone. When the firing lever is finally depressed, the shock wave does not merely sound, it strikes. It flattens the dry grass for hundreds of yards, shattering the windows of nearby villages and rupturing the eardrums of the unwary. 7 tons of high-explosive steel tear through the atmosphere with the sound of a descending locomotive, destined for the Siberia ammunition magazine buried 30 meters beneath the seafloor. The earth-shaking impact signals the beginning of the end for the fortress city of Sevastopol, and the start of one of the most calculated displays of industrial slaughter in the history of the Third Reich. This was not a battle of maneuver. It was a deliberate, ruthless dismantling of a city stone by stone. To understand why the German High Command was willing to commit such a staggering amount of industrial resources to a single port city, one must look at the map of the Eastern Front in the late summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the massive three-pronged invasion of the Soviet Union, had seen the Wehrmacht tear through the Red Army's border defenses with a speed that shocked the world. But as the Northern and Central Army groups lunged toward Leningrad and Moscow, the southern flank faced a more complex geographic reality. The Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, but the Crimea was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Black Sea. For Adolf Hitler, the Crimean Peninsula was a strategic dagger pointed at the Romanian oil fields of Ploieștița, lifeblood of the German motorization. If Soviet long-range bombers continued to operate from the airfields around Sevastopol, the entire German war effort could be grounded by a single successful raid on the refineries. The order was absolute. The Crimea must be cleared. In September 1941, the task fell to General Erich von Manstein and the 11th Army. Manstein, widely regarded as the finest operational mind in the German General Staff, looked at the Perekop Isthmus, the narrow 5-mile neck of land connecting the Crimea to the mainland, and saw a bottleneck of death. The Soviet 51st Army had spent months digging into the Tatar Ditch, an ancient fortification they had modernized with machine gun nests and anti-tank pits. The initial German assault was a brutal, grinding affair. Unlike the sweeping blitzkrieg maneuvers seen in the plains of Poland, the fight for the Perekop was a return to the static, bloody attrition of the First World War. German infantrymen, supported by Stuka dive bombers, had to clear every trench by hand. By late October, the German 11th Army finally broke through the gate, and the Red Army began a frantic retreat. As the Soviet forces fell back, the Germans expected a total collapse. They surged south, occupying the capital of Simferopol and the historic city of Yalta. It seemed the peninsula was theirs. However, as the 11th Army approached the southwestern tip of the Crimea, they encountered the Sevastopol defensive area. Sevastopol was not merely a city, it was one of the most heavily fortified places on the planet. Built into the rugged limestone cliffs and deep ravines of the coast, it featured 3 distinct belts of defense. There were hundreds of miles of trenches, thousands of bunkers, and, most dauntingly, the coastal batteries. Massive naval turrets, such as Maxim Gorky I, housed twin 305mm guns that could hurl shells weighing nearly half a ton at targets 20 miles away. By December 1941, the German advance hit a wall. Manstein's first attempt to take the city by storm failed amidst a blistering Soviet counteroffensive and the onset of a brutal winter. The Ruthless Act that was to follow was born from this frustration. Hitler and Manstein realized that Sevastopol could not be taken by soldiers alone. It would have to be erased from the earth by the weight of metal. By the spring of 1942, the strategic stalemate at the gates of Sevastopol had become an obsession for the German High Command. While the rest of the world watched the shifting front lines near Moscow, the Crimean Peninsula became a laboratory for a different kind of warfare, the siege of total annihilation. Erich von Manstein, recently promoted and fueled by the pressure of Hitler's personal directives, knew that a standard infantry assault against the Soviet Black Sea fortress would result in the liquidation of his entire army. The Soviet defenders, under Vice Admiral Philip Oktyabrski, had turned the city into a subterranean labyrinth. They had burrowed into the limestone, creating underground cities complete with hospitals, schools, and munitions factories. To the German observers on the heights of the Belbek Valley, the city looked like a peaceful port, but beneath the surface, it was a reinforced cage of steel and concrete. The German response was the authorization of Operation Sturgeon. This was not merely a military plan, it was an industrial mobilization. Manstein demanded, and received, the largest concentration of heavy artillery in the history of the Wehrmacht. It was here that the German philosophy of Vernichtungsschlacht, the battle of destruction, took on a literal, physical meaning. To break the Soviet spirit and their concrete carapaces, the Germans moved 1,300 pieces of artillery to the hills surrounding the city. This included the most terrifying weapons in the Nazi arsenal, the 600mm Karl Gerhardt mortars, named Thor and Odin, which fired shells the size of small cars, and the centerpiece, the 800mm Schwere Gustav. The logistics of this build-up were staggering. Thousands of TOT organization laborers were forced to lay miles of new track to support the weight of the siege engines. Special curved tracks were constructed for the railway guns, so they could be aimed by moving the entire train. As the German 11th Army waited, the atmosphere in the Crimea grew heavy. The local population, caught between the hammer of the German siege and the anvil of Soviet no-retreat orders, lived in the shadow of these metal giants. Manstein's strategy was to pulverize the defense. He intended to use a 5-day preliminary bombardment of such intensity that no human nervous system could remain intact. He wasn't looking for a tactical breach. He was looking for a psychological and physical collapse. The build-up was completed by early June. The German forces had amassed over 1 million shells. For every meter of the Soviet front line, there would be a rain of steel. The stage was set for a ruthless display of power that would serve as a warning to the rest of the Soviet Union. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Siege of Sevastopol, one must look beyond the maps and into the specific angles of reality that defined this period of the war. The first and most imposing of these is the technological angle. The German war machine had developed a fascination with superweapons that bordered on the occult, and the Schwere Gustav was the pinnacle of this obsession. Designed by Krupp, this 800mm behemoth was a relic of a bygone era of siege warfare, updated with the terrifying precision of 20th century optics. It required a crew of 2,000 men just to operate, ranging from engineers and master loaders to a dedicated battalion of secret police to guard it, and a specialized Luftwaffe unit to provide a constant anti-aircraft umbrella. The shell alone stood nearly 4 meters high. When it was fired, The barrel recoiled with such force that it displaced the very air in the valley, creating a vacuum that could knock a man unconscious. This was technology pushed to its absolute physical limit, a ruthless application of German engineering meant to prove that no fortress on earth could withstand the Reich's will. Directly tied to this was the tactical bunker buster philosophy. Manstein and his engineers faced a unique problem. The Soviet Fort Maxim Gorky won. This was not a traditional castle, but a massive underground complex topped with 2 armoured turrets, each housing 305mm naval guns. The concrete protecting the magazines was several metres thick, reinforced with high tensile steel. The German tactical solution was a vertical assault. While the infantry pinned the Soviet defenders in their trenches, the heavy mortars, the Karl Gerät series, were used to lob 2-ton shells at high angles. The goal was to use gravity to drive these massive projectiles straight through the roof of the Soviet fortifications. It was a mathematical approach to slaughter. Each shot was meticulously spotted by Fieseler Stork observation planes, correcting the aim of the giants in the valley below. The Germans weren't just fighting a battle, they were conducting a demolition project on a metropolitan scale. They sought to negate the bravery of the individual Soviet soldier by simply removing the ground he stood upon. This tactical ruthlessness extended to the use of Goliath tracked mine, small, remote-controlled tanks filled with explosives, which were sent into the Soviet tunnels to collapse them from the inside. The battlefield was no longer a place of honour, but an industrial furnace where the primary objective was the systematic erasure of the enemy's structural environment. While the German side was defined by its cold, mechanical precision, the human angle of the Soviet defence was characterised by a desperate, almost transcendental defiance. The defenders of Sevastopol were not just regular infantry. They were the Black Sea Marines. Clad in their distinctive dark naval uniforms, these sailors turned soldiers became known to the Germans as the Black Death. For the Soviet sailor, the city was more than a base. It was their home port. When their ships were sunk or trapped in the harbour, they stripped the machine guns from the decks, carried them into the hills, and prepared to die. There are historically verified accounts of Soviet soldiers, out of ammunition, leaping from the cliffs onto German bayonets, or detonating their own magazines to ensure the enemy gained nothing but a creator. This was a ruthless act of counter-defiance, a scorched earth policy applied to the very souls of the defenders. In the Suhanaya ravine, Soviet women worked alongside men in the underground workshops, filling bottles with incendiary fluid, while the ceiling vibrated from 600mm impacts. The psychological toll was absolute. For 250 days, no one in Sevastopol lived without the constant, deafening roar of incoming iron. This leads directly into the duel of wills between the leadership. The siege was a personal chess match between Erich von Manstein and Admiral Philipp Oktyabrski. Manstein was the quintessential Prussian aristocrat, calculating, detached, and obsessed with the clean solution of a kinetic breakthrough. To him, the city was a geometric puzzle to be solved with more weight, more fire, and more pressure. Conversely, Oktyabrski was under the "not a step back" directive from Moscow. He was operating in a state of constant crisis, managing a dwindling supply line that relied on daring midnight runs by submarines and fast destroyers through a German-controlled sea. The leadership on both sides was equally ruthless, but in different directions. Manstein was willing to expend millions of marks in ammunition and thousands of lives for a symbolic victory. Oktyabrski was willing to sacrifice an entire generation of sailors to buy time for the defenses at Stalingrad to hold. This was the ultimate collision of German technical superiority against Soviet industrial-scale sacrifice. As the final shells were loaded into the Schwere Gustav, the calculations of the leaders were about to meet the reality of the climax. The morning of June 5, 1942, marked the beginning of a 5-day sequence that remains one of the most concentrated displays of firepower in human history. It was the start of the final assault, codenamed Operation Sturgeon. Manstein's plan was to unleash a storm of steel so violent that the Soviet lines would cease to exist as a coherent entity. For 120 hours, the sky over Sevastopol was never silent. The German 11th Army opened fire with every barrel at its disposal, from the light 10.5 centimeter howitzers to the gargantuan Schwere Gustav. The observers on the heights of Inkerman described a horizon that flickered like a continuous strobe light. The city was not just being shelled, it was being ground into dust. The Siberia ammunition magazine, located deep beneath the northern shore of Severnaya Bay, was considered invulnerable by the Soviets. It was protected by 30 meters of earth and a thick cap of natural stone. On the first day of the barrage, the Schwere Gustav fired 9 rounds. One of these 7-ton projectiles struck the magazine with such kinetic force that it pierced the rock, the earth, and the concrete ceiling before detonating. The resulting explosion was so massive that it sent a shockwave through the harbor, causing a mini tsunami that capsized small Soviet supply boats. To the Soviet sailors watching from the opposite shore, it appeared as if the earth itself had revolted. By June 13th, the German infantry began to move. Under the cover of the smoke and the deafening roar of the Karl mortars, the 22nd and 24th Infantry Divisions crawled toward the northern forts. The landscape had been transformed into a moonscape. The lush Crimean hills were now nothing but grey craters and splinters of wood. The Soviet defenders, many of them deaf and suffering from severe concussions, emerged from the ruins to fight with a primal ferocity. They fought for every bunker, often forcing the Germans to use flamethrowers to clear out positions that had been bypassed. The Stalin Fort, a key position in the northern sector, became the scene of a horrific struggle. German combat engineers, lugging heavy satchel charges, had to scale the debris of the fort, while Soviet machine gunners, chained to their weapons by their own officers to ensure they fought to the last, poured fire into the gap. The ruthlessness was total. There was no room for surrender in the dust of the crumbling concrete. By June 17th, the German assault had reached a fever pitch. The Maxim Gorky 1 battery, the crown jewel of the Soviet northern defense, was finally silenced after a sustained pounding from the 600mm Thor mortar. German engineers crawled over the jagged steel of the shattered turrets, dropping smoke grenades and gasoline into the ventilation shafts to force out the survivors. The fall of the northern forts opened the gateway to Severnaya Bay. Manstein, realizing that a frontal assault across the water would be a massacre, executed a daring and brutal night crossing. On June 29th, under the cover of a massive smokescreen and without a preliminary bombardment to maintain surprise, German troops of the 132nd Infantry Division crossed the bay in rubber boats. They landed directly in the heart of the Soviet rear. The shock was total. The Soviet command structure, already fractured by the relentless hammering of the Schwere Gustav, began to disintegrate. The fighting moved into the city streets. This was no longer a battle of heavy guns. It was a battle of the bayonet and the hand grenade. The Black Sea Marines made their final stand in the ruins of the Malakoff Kurgana historic fortification from the Crimean War of the 1850s. History was repeating itself in the most violent way possible. Soviet soldiers, having retreated into the vast network of limestone caves beneath the city, refused to emerge. The German response was cold and systematic. Combat engineers sealed the cave entrances with explosives or pumped in carbon monoxide from idling tank engines. By July 1, Admiral Oktyabrski and the High Command were evacuated by submarine, leaving behind over 100,000 soldiers and civilians with orders to fight to the last man. The final Soviet perimeter collapsed at Cape Chersonese. Thousands of Red Army soldiers stood on the cliffs, looking out at the Black Sea for rescue ships that would never arrive. As German panzers rolled toward the shoreline, hundreds of Soviet soldiers chose to jump from the cliffs rather than face German captivity. The city of Sevastopol, which had stood for 250 days against the full might of the Wehrmacht, was now a smoking graveyard of limestone and iron. The red flag over the city was replaced by the swastika, marking the end of the costliest siege of the war to date. But as the dust settled, the true nature of the German victory began to reveal itself in the shadows of the ruins. The silence that fell over the ruins of Sevastopol on July 4, 1942, was more haunting than the thunder of the Schwere Gustav. For the survivors, the ruthless act of the siege transitioned into a cold, administrative horror. Of the estimated 100,000 Soviet defenders left on the shores of Cape Chersonese, nearly 95,000 were marched into a captivity from which few would return. They were herded into open-air transit camps, carved out of the very limestone dust they had defended, with no food, no water, and no shelter from the blistering Crimean sun. The psychological consequence for the German 11th Army was a dangerous surge of hubris. They had achieved what many thought impossible: the total destruction of a modern superfortress. However, the strategic cost was staggering. The 11th Army had been bled white. The victory at Sevastopol cost the Germans over 35,000 casualties, including some of their most experienced combat engineers and mountain troops. These were men who would be desperately needed in the months to follow. Furthermore, the cleansing of the Crimea began almost immediately. Following the combat troops were the Einsatzgruppenmobil killing squads. Under the pretext of securing the rear against partisans, thousands of Crimean civilians, including the Jewish population of Simferopol and Sevastopol, were systematically executed. The German leadership viewed the peninsula not just as a military prize, but as a future German colony, Gotenland, to be repopulated by ethnic Germans. The ruthless military victory was merely the preamble to a much larger project of racial engineering. In the Soviet Union, the fall of the city was a national trauma, but also a rallying cry. The hero city status of Sevastopol was forged in the stories of the sailors who fought until their magazines exploded. The loss of the Black Sea Fleet's primary base forced the Soviet Navy into a marginal role for the remainder of the war. Yet the 250-day delay had served its purpose. While Manstein was meticulously positioning his railway guns in the Crimea, the German Case Bluth summer offensive toward the Volga, losing its most precious resource: time. The strategic ripples of Sevastopol's fall extended far beyond the borders of the Crimea, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the German war effort. In the immediate wake of the victory, Erich von Manstein was promoted to Generalfeldmarschall, rewarded for his ability to translate industrial power into a tactical triumph. However, this promotion came with a heavy price. The German High Command now believed that any fortification, no matter how formidable, could be broken by the sheer application of heavy metal. This hubris led to a fatal misallocation of resources. The Schwere Gustav and the massive Karlgerät mortars, which had performed so effectively in the static environment of a siege, were dismantled and shipped north to the Leningrad front. Thousands of rail cars and specialized engineers were tied up in this logistical nightmare, moving weapons that were effectively useless in the fluid, mobile warfare that was beginning to define the Eastern Front. The Germans had won a spectacular battle, but they had become enamored with the tools of a previous century. Diplomatically, the fall of Sevastopol signaled to the Axis satellites, Romania and Italy, that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. It encouraged them to commit more troops to the Southern Front, units that would later be decimated in the encirclement at Stalingrad. Strategically, the ruthless act of the siege had a secondary, unintended effect. It taught the Red Army how to survive and fight within the ruins of a city. The lessons learned by the Soviet survivors of subterranean movement, sniper nests, and the utilization of rubble as a defensive asset would be refined and implemented with devastating effect just a few months later in the factories of Stalingrad. The technology of the siege also reached its dead end here. The Schwere Gustav would never fire another shot in anger. It spent the rest of the war as a white elephant, a monument to the Reich's obsession with superweapons that offered diminishing returns. The ruthless efficiency shown at Sevastopol was the last time the Wehrmacht would hold the absolute initiative in a siege of this scale. As the German 11th Army was partitioned and sent to different sectors, the cohesive force that had conquered the Crimea vanished, leaving the southern flank vulnerable to the coming Soviet storm. The Siege of Sevastopol remains more than just a footnote of the Eastern Front. It stands as a grim monument to the era of industrialized total war. In the limestone dust of the Crimea, the world witnessed the final, most extreme evolution of the 19th century siege, a moment where human bravery was systematically countered by the absolute weight of engineering. The German iron fist proved that any wall could be breached and any bunker collapsed, but in doing so, it revealed a fundamental truth about the nature of conflict. Tactical perfection does not guarantee strategic victory. The ruthlessness of the German assault, the deployment of the Schwere Gustav, the chemical clearing of the caves, and the cold indifference to the fate of the city's inhabitants did not break the Soviet spirit. It calcified it. The 250 days of Sevastopol's resistance became a psychological blueprint for the Red Army. They learned that even when the sky rains 7-ton shells, infantrymen in the rubble remains the final arbiter of the battlefield. The Germans, blinded by the smoke of their own artillery, failed to see that they were trading their finest soldiers for a heap of broken stone, while the clock of the wider war continued to tick toward their own destruction. Ultimately, the event reveals a recurring tragedy of leadership, the belief that technology can replace the human element of war. Erich von Manstein's victory was a masterpiece of logistics and ballistics, yet it led his army into a strategic dead end. As we look back at the ruins of the hero city, we see the hubris of a regime that believed its will could be forged in steel and imposed through fire. History, however, would prove that while a city can be erased, the defiance born of such a ruthless act only fuels the fire of the coming retribution.